Let's talk to someone else who understands the numbers. That's Sir John Redwood, the former Conservative Cabinet Minister. Sir John, thank you for joining me today. Just in layman's terms, just lay this out for us, for people who are not economists, who are not experts like you. What's going on? Why does it affect us? Why is the price of debt so expensive now? That leads to other things like the price of groceries going up. Tell us, just explain this to us if you don't mind, Sir John.
Yes, the price of debt going up is bad news for mortgage holders, because when they need to renew their mortgage, it's at a higher rate, or if they want to take out a new one, it's more difficult, more expensive. There's knock-on to prices in the shops from the budget tax increases we've seen. And above all, the government has less money to spend on nurses, doctors and teachers, and we need more of those, because it's got so much more to spend on just paying the interest bill on all the money it is borrowing. And every time some of the borrowings run out, they have to reissue new debt, roll them over, and it's going to be at a much higher interest rate, so they're going to have much less money to spend on other good things. But what we're seeing is the markets have been very upset by the impact of the budget. All those tax rises, instead of narrowing the deficit in the way they planned, are in danger of doing the opposite, because growth has collapsed. We were growing quite quickly at the beginning of the year. We're not growing at all anymore. And if you stop growing, you don't get increased tax revenue coming in, and you get increased costs. The state has to pay more benefits to people who don't get a job or who lose their job. Industries need more subsidy because they're not making so much profit. So unfortunately, the accounts are going wrong because the growth has stopped. And I think a big reason for the growth stopping is the huge impact on business and consumers of those very big tax rises.
Was it far too big a risk to rely on business in this budget to say, well, there's a tax shortfall, you'll make it up?
Yes, of course it was, because business, in many cases, were not making big profits. And if they suddenly have to pay, say, 10% more for the people they're already employing, how are they going to pay that? It's more than their profit. So they've either got to put their prices up or they have to cut their costs. And that means sacking people and doing less. And so we've got into that doom loop. The higher taxes to reduce the deficit are not reducing it the way imagined, because suddenly businesses are saying, you know what, I've got to put the prices up, do a bit less, and I'm stopping hiring people. And it's the very opposite of what we need. We need more business, more growth. Because you see, every extra pound that a business generates or an individual gets paid in wages is going to be the most highly taxed pound that they've got. And so it's very tax rich. So if you stop people and stop companies earning extra money, they're not going to be paying all that additional profits tax, or they're not going to be paying those higher rates of income tax, which people have to do when their earnings go up.
Who's to blame for this situation that we're in? Is it Rachel Reeves? Is it global factors? I mean, Darren Jones would have us believe that the economy and the debt markets are all working efficiently and as they're meant to work. Is this Rachel Reeves' fault? Is this global factors? Who's to blame here?
Yeah, a very big bit of the blame must rest with the government, because as I've been describing, it was the run-up to the budget with all the talk about tax rises that started to kill confidence, and it was then the very big tax rises, particularly on business, which killed confidence, affected attitudes towards hiring people and paying people more, that has done so much specific UK damage. Now, it is quite true that the longer-term interest rates for government have gone up a bit in the States as well, not as much as in the UK, but they have gone up a bit, and that would have had some impact. But the majority impact, the reason the pound is tumbling as well as the interest rates going up here, is the budget. Because in America, the interest rates have gone up a bit, but the dollar has gone up because people think it's a strong economy and it's growing rather well.
Liz Truss is the former Prime Minister. I know you have supported quite a few of her thoughts and measures, and ideologically you're pretty similar, not identical, of course. But in a post on her social media accounts, she had this message for Labour on the economy and on her personal record as Prime Minister. Let's have a look at what Liz Truss said earlier today.
Rachel Reeves has pushed this country to the brink of economic crisis through high taxes, high regulation and disastrous net zero policies. When I tried to fix these problems back in 2022, I was undermined by the economic establishment, and I was forced to reverse the policies before they were even implemented.
So, John, we know as well that Liz Truss has threatened to, well, in fact, she has sent what's called a cease and desist letter, essentially saying, stop saying it or I'll sue you, to Keir Starmer, who said she crashed the economy. Has that got any credibility?
Well, that's the legal process which will have its own force. I mean, let me point out that...
I should have said, has her contention that, has Keir Starmer's contention that she crashed the economy got, I mean, lots of people will scoff at that and say it's pretty straightforward.
I want to answer your point, but I need to say to your viewers that I offered Liz Truss and Kwasi advice on the budget, which they did not accept. I wanted them to spend and borrow less, and I think that would have helped. But the Bank of England has now studied what went on over the time of that budget, and they have very fairly concluded that the majority of the interest rate changes were the result of Bank of England policy and what was happening in the pension fund market, and were not the direct result of the budget. The budget didn't help, but it wasn't the main cause. And so I think that gives strength to the legal action you're talking about, that at the time, you may remember, the Bank of England was actually putting up its base rates around the time of the budget. At the time of the budget, it announced an eye-poppingly large sale of bonds, £80 billion of bonds to be dumped on the market, which was obviously going to drive the market down. And then the killer was the following Monday, when it emerged that the pension funds had all bought gilts they couldn't afford to fully pay for, and they bought them on a type of credit. And as the bond market fell, they had to pay up rather more money against their positions, which they couldn't afford, so they turned sellers as well. So you had the perfect crisis in the bond market created by Bank of England selling and by pension funds selling, which was nothing to do with Liz Truss. And it was resolved very quickly, because you may remember the Bank of England then switched policy and said, right, we're going to buy a load of bonds. And so the famous 10-year interest rate, which we're all looking at the moment, briefly spiked at 4.38% under Truss. It's currently 4.8%. And it went back down very quickly to 3.1% as soon as the Bank of England started buying the bonds. So the current position is worse than the Liz Truss position, because the rates have been driven higher, and it's very clearly much more to do with the government, because the Bank of England has actually been cutting base rates and hasn't announced a big increase in its bond sales.
But sure, I'm sure you're right with all of that, but surely the 45p tax U-turn, the fact that that Kwasi Kwarteng said, and there's more to come, the fact that there wasn't enough warming up of the economic establishment, which may well have been put paid to Liz Truss to some degree, but essentially shocking the market into what they did, that can't have helped in any way either.
Well, as I told you, it didn't help, but don't believe me, read the Bank of England report. They admit that a lot of what went wrong were all those things to do with how the Bank of England was changing interest rates, managing bonds, and then the pension funds getting into trouble. I do think that it was unhelpful to have a bigger deficit, and it's exactly that bigger deficit which is haunting the current government. And the extra spending in the case of Liz Truss was a whole load of subsidies to energy, and I, for example, didn't think that better off people like MPs with 2 homes should get 2 lots of energy subsidy. But that happened, and unfortunately the markets took it awry, and it's been common now to always blame the Liz Truss government. But I do think people interested in the subject seriously need to look at those interest rate rises, those bond sales, and the pension fund problems, which were a very important part of that mini crisis. They should also remember that the rates came down again, and they stayed lower than they are today. So the government has to answer, why is it that your rates are considerably worse than the Truss rates, when all you want to do is trash Liz Truss and blame her, when her actions two or more years ago are nothing to do with the very high rates today?
Let me ask you just before you go about what Andy Burnham has said. This is the Mayor of Greater Manchester. He set up his views in an inquiry into the scandal around paedophile gangs. He spoke to BBC Radio Manchester a bit earlier today.
In my view, the government was right to reject that form of opportunism. But I did hear last night, coming out of that debate, ministers saying they are open to discussing issues now with survivors. And I will add my voice into this and say, I do think there is the case for a limited national inquiry that draws on reviews like the one that I commissioned and the one we've seen in Rotherham, the one we've seen in Telford, to draw out some of these national issues and compel people to give evidence who then may have charges to answer and be held to account. That is something I couldn't do at my level.
What do you make of what Andy Burnham has said there, Sir John?
Well, I'd like to praise him for that, because I think it's a very sensible statement. I think it's a great pity this week that the government didn't take the opportunity both to see their bill through and to grant an inquiry, because then the opposition would obviously have backed off from its motion. And that would have been a much better outcome. I was pleased to see the Prime Minister moving in the direction of inquiry. I think Andy Burnham has given some reasons why you might want one. I think the public is desperate for one because they feel this has been covered up by successive governments, starting with Labour and going through the coalition and Conservative years. And they want to know who covered up what. And they don't just want the rapists prosecuted, they still haven't been, but they also want some of the senior officials who may have actively covered things up to also be disciplined.
John, thank you. That's Sir John Redwood there, the former Conservative Cabinet Minister.